Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special international panel where we're going to be talking about mega-constellations in space. Are they a challenge? My name is Dr. Cassandra Steer. I'm a senior lecturer at the Australian National University College of Law, and I'm a mission specialist with the Australian National University Institute for Space. With me, I have a very impressive panel. I have Senjuti Mallick, who is a compliance and strategic partnership specialist with COMSPOC. We also have joining us Dr. Beyza Unal, Deputy Director at the International Security Program at Chatham House. Narayan Prasad, who is the Chief Operations Officer at SatSearch. And Laxmesh BH, who's the Head of Missiles and Aerospace Business of Precision and Manufacturing and Systems Complex at Larsen and Toubro Limited. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for bringing your expertise to this discussion. So in recent years, mega-constellations have been developed at an unprecedented pace, with companies placing an enormous number of satellites into orbit. And this rapid growth of mega-constellations has increased the risk for space, the global commons. As this development intensifies, there's a need to look at how the current regulatory frameworks and approaches can be further modified, or how new regulations can be developed to account for these new proposed challenges. So just to give a little bit of context as to why these mega-constellations cause so many issues and concerns, space debris and the problem of space traffic management was already an issue of concern in the 1970s. Donald Kessler is the famous astrophysicist who coined the term the Kessler syndrome, which is the risk that if we have such a critical mass of space debris that the debris starts to collide with other bits of debris and will have a cascading effect. So already in the 1970s, that was a concern. Between 1994 and 2018, the orbital debris population is estimated to have increased 7-fold. So today, in 2021, we have about 3,800 operational satellites and approximately 128 million pieces of debris that go down to the size of 1 centimetre, with a total estimated mass of about 800,000 tonnes. Satellites are also getting much smaller. They used to be 5,000 kilograms or more. Today, they can be the size of 1 kilogram or even smaller. And most of this traffic is in low Earth orbit. These are the orbits that are closest to the Earth, and they're orbiting at about 7 kilometers a second, so 10 times the speed of a bullet. That means that even something that is the size of 1 centimeter can cause absolutely lethal damage to a satellite. And the prediction, especially with the rise of these mega-constellations, that in the next decade, we will see the number of operational satellites rise to 100,000. And you can imagine that the amount of debris is going to increase in correlation with that. So very, very briefly, the main mega-constellations that we see being developed today are SpaceX's Starlink, currently about 1,500 satellites, but that is planned to be 40,000 satellites in the next 10 years. Most of those are around 500 kilometers from the Earth. The biggest competitor for that is Amazon Kuiper, which will eventually be, in the next 10 years, 3,200 satellites, also at about that altitude, 590 kilometers. And then there's OneWeb, which is smaller, but still a mega constellation. There's about 300 of them orbiting the Earth today, and there will be about 650 of those orbiting at a slightly higher altitude at about 1,200 kilometers. It's providing global high-speed internet, which one would assume is a good thing, but it's bringing with it many, many challenges. So I'd like to start with you, Narayan, if I could, please. Space is often described as congested, contested, and competitive. And it's competitive because it's now dominated by commercial players. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how the rise of mega constellations impact that commercial playing field. Does it mean that those commercially interesting orbits are going to become so crowded that there's literally no space for new entrants to be able to join the space sector and benefit from space?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me here. And I see that, the panel has actually quite a wide array of perspectives. So I'm going to play, let's say, the entrepreneur here as to what can entrepreneurs do with respect to all of this. I mean, at the end of the day, space for any entrepreneur is just a tool. And like any other tool out there, be it the internet or be it, whatever medium out there, and we are looking to, use space as a medium of modernizing society and solving problems right at the end. So unfortunately, the problem of broadband, needs thousands of these satellites to be up. Now, the question is, it was the same, 50 years ago when the airplane revolution took place, where you had to build 1,000 new airports around the world, and you had to have 10,000 aircraft fly, and there was the problem of how do you actually coordinate between different airlines, different languages, different operation schemes, different technologies on the ground to track them, and so on. So I would say, from an entrepreneur's perspective, problems needs to be solved, but it comes with other problems when it comes to managing these assets. It's already been done in the aviation sector quite well, and you've dramatically reduced the number of these collisions between aircrafts over many decades now. Now it's a question of what is the role of regulators or even operators themselves in coordinating between each other, and hopefully we will reach a level of confidence in the operational environment where people don't need to be routinely worried about spacecraft colliding with each other because of miscoordination and so on. So I guess we are in this mode of transition, and the aviation sector is a very, very good example as to how we could learn from all of that.
Yeah, indeed. So that competition is also a good thing, I guess, in terms of the kinds of technologies that these mega constellations can offer. Laxmesh, I wonder if I could come to you now and ask you to talk to us a little bit about some of the security considerations of this mega increase in space traffic. There are obviously difficulties in attributing if something goes wrong with a satellite system. It's very difficult already to know whether that's due to a bit of space debris or perhaps due to some nefarious, harmful intervention or interference. Does the rise of mega constellations compound that? Does it create new kinds of issues for space security?
Well, Cassandra, I look at this as not just a security concern, but also as a safety concern. So I would like to address this in 2 or 3 buckets. One is looking at security and safety of the space assets from the other space assets. And another is security and safety of the human on Earth from the space assets. So we need to look at each one a little different way. Now, we have seen that, Narayan mentioned about how in aviation we have dealt with the situation. We have the amount of traffic going on the roads in the metros across the countries. We have the maritime traffic going out. We have the aviation traffic going up. So we have, over a period, dealt with all these kinds of situations. And we have brought in rules and regulations for safe management of these kinds of traffics. One of the things that we have of late introduced is about the smart vehicles. If the cars can be smart enough to have collision prevention, maintaining the distance between them, cruise speed, autopilot, lane control, I think we can certainly do this and mandate it in all the space assets. And then we have specific space highways, unidirectional space highways. So I think then the speed of 7 kilometers per second would actually, if all of them are traveling at that, relatively they are at rest. So therefore it wouldn't really be such a commotion. So I believe that the security and safety of the space assets from other space assets can be very easily handled by bringing in, one, these specific features, mandatory features in each of these space assets. Number two, bringing in those regulations like the laws of the seas. We have international waters treaties and we have aviation security norms. So we can bring in something very similar in the international space as well. Now, the second one is a little bit tricky one, where the security of the space assets who have either gone rogue or adrift or falling down or piracy in space. I think these needs to be dealt with a very different Interpol in the space, wherein we come with space police who would actually are capable of handling these kinds of situation, pulling these guys off the main track, or kind of neutralizing them if it is required to be so. I believe these kinds of thoughts are already on and it's going to become part of an international regulation. And I believe if we are bringing in these two major changes, this whole thing can be handled easily. The third is about security, the cyber security. I think that is something which is already in, and there are multiple ways that we are handling this in different levels of encryption, and I think it's only going to go beyond. So I see that this is a situation that can be very well handled.
Thank you, Laxmesh. It's nice to hear some optimism around this. I have to admit that I spend most of my time with great concerns about what's going on with space traffic management, and we don't have an international space law sufficient or any kind of regulation, nor do we have any international governance body that could act as that kind of police organization, or even if we think, as Narayan said, in terms of the International Civil Aviation Organization, the UN body that really does do a lot to manage air traffic and ensuring that there are international agreements around technology. We absolutely need to move in that direction, but the very physics of space cause us some difficulties. And you mentioned also the cyber security, which is a great segue. Are there increased cyber issues and cyber security issues when we're thinking about mega constellations, as opposed to prior to mega constellations, we already had a lot of space traffic and a lot of issues with cyber security. Are there increased concerns when we're talking about these mega constellations?
So yes, I think that there are some cyber challenges that exist across the spectrum with traditional satellites and mega constellations, and we need to be aware of them. And there are some, I think, new things that comes with mega constellations that we need to be aware of. In the traditional, satellite space, I think we're concerned of cyber risks from the design stage to the production stage of the space technology. And the common challenges to cybersecurity in general exists both within the space segment, but also in the ground segment. And most of the time we forget about the user segment, which is the uplink and the downlink telemetry data that is sent. And there is also cyber challenges that comes with that as well. So in three segments, we need to be talking about cybersecurity. And cyber vulnerabilities so far have been studied in the traditional architecture of the space segments or the space systems. For instance, we know that there is an increasing need to develop resiliency across the position, navigation, and timing capabilities. We are aware that the GPS itself actually is vulnerable to cyber intrusion. So there has been a constant look for different type of PNT capabilities in that regard. With the mega constellations, however, I think we need to consider a few other added layers on cybersecurity. We're talking about constellations that rely on web of networks that are connected across different units. We're talking about incorporated Internet of Things applications for communications purposes, for instance. And we know that Internet of Things applications, when they're used on Earth, when they're used, for instance, within the energy sector or any other sectors, there are embedded cyber dependencies and vulnerabilities within those applications themselves. So when you incorporate that into the space realm, that you're also adding up that vulnerability. You need to be aware of that vulnerability. And also we need to understand that all these elements comes with the digitalization. The digitalization itself creates that dependency and creates that vulnerability. And there are ways to solve that cybersecurity challenge, I believe. And the second added risk that I would like to mention is about running complex systems. Mega constellations are complex systems. We're talking about systems that are inherently complex by their design. And building and maintaining complex systems is a challenge from a systems engineering perspective. And generally, if you look at trustworthy systems, these are generally the trustworthy systems are the systems that are simple in their design. The simplistic you can make a system, the easier it becomes in a way to understand the reliability and integrity of data and the systems within that. So when you develop, when you do rapid development, and when you build fast, then things might get sloppy. And things might get sloppy either during the testing stage or in the design stage. So what we need to do is we need to do rigorous testing, for instance, and we need to make sure that we're having enough time between the development of a product and the time that it is launched to space. And once the product is developed, once it's designed, it's harder to fix the vulnerabilities after that systems is designed, and we need to be really aware of that. So those 2 points, I think, are key when we think about mega constellations in cyber, which is a bit different than the traditional satellites.
Thank you, Beyza, because I think that just understanding that by definition a complex system has default vulnerabilities. It reminds me of a couple of years ago when SpaceX had a near collision with a European Space Agency satellite, an ESA satellite. And Starlink, the SpaceX Mega-constellation, does have an automated collision avoidance system, but it turned that off when it had this near collision, and from what I understand, the conjecture, or perhaps today the current knowledge, is that it is a Starlink on Starlink collision avoidance software. So it will avoid Starlink satellites as part of this mega constellation that will be 40,000 satellites over the next few years colliding with each other, but not necessarily with other satellites or bits of debris. And so that complexity, even if we do have automated solutions for those problems, that they have inbuilt vulnerabilities. Beyza, what you mentioned about the regulatory environment is perhaps also, again, the great segue. Now, Senjuti, I would like to come to you because this is your area of expertise. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the current regulatory frameworks and whether they're adequate to deal with the challenges of mega constellations. So, Senjuti, the current international space law and space governance has been making advances with non-binding instruments. We, of course, have the 2019 long-term sustainability guidelines adopted by the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Prior to that, we had the international, the Interagency Debris Committee's guidelines on space debris mitigation. Are these non-binding instruments enough, do you think? And if I could ask you also then to say a little bit about the responsibility that is placed on states, both in those non-binding instruments and also by virtue of Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says that states themselves are responsible for every activity in outer space, whether that's governmental or private commercial activities. Is relieving that onus on the states the best way to push for new governance or for binding laws?
Sure. Thank you so much, Cassandra. So the guidelines that you rightly mentioned are great first steps and crucial for building a more robust mechanism. For example, even the ITU also allocates orbital slots and spectrums to countries launching telecommunication satellites on a first-come, first-served basis, though. Now, the principles that are enshrined under the existing space treaties and ITU frameworks currently do not envisage a mechanism for space traffic management. Additionally, the exclusive orbital usage by mega constellations for the economic benefits is still fairly an unregulated domain. So the issue with non-binding nature of these recommendations is that they significantly impact implementation and accountability. Now, to push towards binding laws that could, could be brought about through few simultaneous mechanisms, not all international community-based and not all national law-based. To begin with, or start with the most basic, which is the Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, that's talking about outer space, which is not a subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use of occupation, or by any other means. My suggestion here is the expansion of the interpretation of Article 2 to go on to include first the deployment of mega constellations and their associated risks of collision that impede outer space endeavors by developed countries or any other country who wants to enter into the race. Because the first pro-mega constellation argument that comes in, that it comes as a benefit and interest of all mankind, it provides affordable and global broadband services. The second part of this would be that the phrase any other means in Article 2 should also indicate that there may be means other than claims of sovereignty or ownership that constitute as appropriation of outer space. To that end, how could this be achieved? Towards this, we have Article 31, Clause 3 of the Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties that allows for subsequent practice influencing treaty interpretations and thereby establishing a contemporary meaning of Article 2. In the same vein, an expansion of Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty interpretation, from where the state responsibility is derived, it would also be very crucial. Given the involvement of multiple states in their operations in these mega constellations, it would be difficult to pinpoint just one state to be responsible for the activities of any mega constellation. For example, OneWeb satellite, when that was launched, it was from a Russian spaceport. However, the Russian government did not allow OneWeb to provide internet connectivity services in Russia. What happens in this catch-22 situation? Here, the phrase national space activities under Article 6 of OST could expand to all activities, to anything that could be like a special connection with the concerned state, or would effectively be a part of territorial or quasi-territorial personal jurisdiction. That said, private space law instruments such as the, I believe, the Cape Town Convention and Space Protocol could maybe also assist in this development. And just one last small point here on the national front would be of that from an environmental standpoint. For example, France has gone ahead and has developed laws that caters towards that spacecrafts that are in lower orbit to deorbit within 25 years. This is a very progressive state for a nation to bring it as a part of its national laws. That would definitely have a better impact on making it more binding, as opposed for it to be at a more periphery level for an international organization to come together to only have some recommendations and guidelines which don't end up being ratified and hence don't end up becoming binding.
Yeah, indeed. I think I agree with you entirely that there's actually a lot of hope to be placed on those national laws, those domestic laws, where at the international level we have huge challenges of political will and, at least in the UN bodies, consensus decision making, that if although perhaps there's a little bit too much resting on the shoulders of states who are also keen to be competitive in the space economy, at the same time, the long-term sustainability guidelines are all about encouraging states in their domestic space licensing laws to start to think more about long-term sustainability, debris mitigation, design for demise, these kinds of things. And the UK, of course, was quite proactive in implementing a reporting mechanism immediately after those guidelines were adopted. And we're seeing many countries starting to have a very positive race to show up as a more sustainable regulator for their space activities. So thank you, Senjuti. I want to come back to you again, Beyza, to see what kind of lessons we can learn in terms of cyber policy and other kinds of security policy, because it's nearly impossible today to extract or to separate the civil and the military and security uses of space. They're so intertwined. Many governments and militaries depend, in fact, on commercial providers they outsource a lot of their space-based technologies and their services, or they're using primes and commercial actors to help them develop technology that then becomes their sovereign technology. So that civil and military or security is impossible to separate. What kinds of lessons can we learn from cyber security and cyber policy and other areas of security policy that you have expertise in that might be helpful in terms of thinking about mega constellations and the security and safety issues?
So this is a really good question. From a regulatory perspective, a few lessons probably would be key. The operators and regulators in other fields actually started to look at issue of compliance from new lenses. Traditional approaches of compliance mainly tells you that these are the standards to follow, and the operators do kind of like this tick the box of approach on compliance. But because cyber threats have been dynamic and fast changing, this prescriptive, I would call it as a prescriptive approach. This prescriptive approach seems to be failing. The critical infrastructure, from the critical infrastructure side, we're looking at more on the flexible approaches and what's called performance-based approaches, and they're more on looking at the risks and following up risk-informed analysis. So the operators go ahead even one step further than just applying the standards, but they're also actively looking for the existing risks. And I think that would be very important for the space community as well. Another point in that is, and linked to this, is to do anticipatory regulations. It's more about looking at forward-looking regulation based on what are the threats. It's not only about what are the threats of today, but what are the future threats that we might see in outer space. That could be emerging tech-related threats, could be cyber, it could be unrelated to any of these. And then the third point that I would make probably is about the supply chain security, which is really common across different critical infrastructure as well as with the outer space as well. And basically, through the supply chain, attackers could infiltrate into the systems. That's why we need to think about a better supply chain management. And in the critical national infrastructure area, they're talking about, for instance, creating transparency within the software of a system, because there's lack of understanding on the supply chain today. And that is mainly because we do not know who's involved in the supply chain, and that is also the case in outer space as well. Or how are they developing the products, or what type of software they're using it, where the software is developed, or who will be using that software. So there are a lot of questions that we can ask to create that transparency. I heard an expert speaking on this, and the way that he put it was, it's almost like an ingredient list when you buy a product. You should be able to see what is inside that product, and we should be able to see what is inside that software. And I think that's a really good analogy when you think about cybersecurity and supply chain security. Thank you, Cassandra.
Thank you, Beyza. It's really clear that we, as space starts to, I think, become part of the international agenda, and it's certainly part of the popular imagination today, perhaps for the first time since the 1960s, it really is part of everyone's popular imagination again. But at the same time, there doesn't seem to be enough expertise across disciplines and across these kinds of issues. People seem to be very focused in siloed areas. So there's a lot to be learned from cybersecurity and from other kinds of security policies. So thank you very much. So I want to move us on to a third and final set of questions, which have to do with the key considerations for relevant actors and stakeholders in the future. When we're thinking about, these mega constellations are not going away, all of the issues and challenges we've spoken about are not going away. So what are those key considerations? But perhaps the first question really, and this is for you, Senjuti, is who are the relevant actors and stakeholders? So apart from these commercial entities developing these mega constellations, and apart from the governments who regulate them because they belong to their national jurisdiction, who are the relevant stakeholders and actors, and how do we get them around the table together?
Thank you, Cassandra, for this fantastic question. Just going back to the basics or the fundamentals here. When it comes to actors, it's clearly just the private companies, the ones that are going into space to become satellite operators, that is SpaceX with their Starlink satellite mega constellation, and existing satellite operators and internet providers like OneSky, HughesNet, Boeing, etc. On the relevant national departments are also part of being actors here, such as China's Aerospace, Science and Technology Corp, which is China's main space contractor, and they've acknowledged their intention to launch around 13,000, if I'm not mistaken, state-owned satellite-based internet constellation. They've named it the Guowang, and the EU is also inclined to launching its super constellations for space-based internet services. So these are some of the key actors were there. Now, when it comes down to stakeholders, the SATCON-1 workshop found that the mega constellations will fundamentally be changing ground-based optical and infrared astronomy. and could also impact the appearance of the night sky. So the two major stakeholders here becomes like astronomers, scientists, space traffic management companies, intergovernmental organizations, policy and think tank world. And last but not the least, like general public, you and I, who want to just look up and see the night sky, but soon may not be able to do so because of the obstruction of the natural dark sky during nighttime. So stakeholders who are the advocates for nighttime dark skies, they would be a part of this stakeholder part as well. Now, solutions to enhance like space sustainability can be found in various ways. To get about space traffic governance will require a lot of things to happen simultaneously. And it wouldn't just be one way where we can get all the stakeholders and all the actors to come together on the table on the same day or around the same time. So in my humble opinion, some of the approaches that may be employed could be that at the international level, we increase coordination, cooperation, and working relationship amongst nations or entities. That could also include like the non-governmental entities. One of the best known examples of that coordination is a Space Act agreement that exists between NASA and SpaceX, under the terms of which this agreement, SpaceX agrees to move its Starlink satellite in the event of any close approaches with NASA spacecraft, so that any intended or so that any collisions can be avoided and maneuver can happen in time. In the same breath, there are also, with the US Space Force, SpaceX has entered into a cooperation research and development agreement, which pretty much caters to the same thing and is a good working relationship. So is the case with OneWeb and SpaceX. Another point, which would be for the international community at large, and the community is working towards getting this, is having an open architecture data repository, the OADR, which would combine space situational awareness, the SSA data, from government and commercial sources that could then be used for space traffic management applications, such as potential collision avoidance. Then these put together makes it imperative for all stakeholders and actors to potentially be working towards more sustainable space, a better managed space traffic, and obviously no collisions and no debris creation. Thank you, Cassandra.
Yeah, thank you, Senjuti. So that collaboration between the commercial actors and the governments is really key. I also know that there are some proposals at the moment to have a sustainability rating that will be an internationally recognized way of rating the way that companies are operating, the way they're designing their satellites and their space assets, and what they're going to do at the end of life of those space assets and space systems. So I think that's something to add in there. One other group I would add to the list of stakeholders, as you mentioned, those advocates for dark skies include astronomers, astrophysicists, but I would also add to that a lot of Indigenous peoples around the world who have not only a long history of depending on the cosmos and the stars for navigation and tracking seasons and animals and food sources, but there are many who live today with those traditional ways of living, but who also have a very important relationship to the stars as they do to their lands and waters. And if that's being interrupted by constantly visible artificial satellites, feel free to answer that same question. But the question I also had for you was, and you had quite an optimistic view on this, are mega-constellations something we should be celebrating for the technologies that they provide?
Well, Cassandra, I'm an optimistic, number one. Number two, I do have great faith, trust, and belief in mankind. And over the years, I think mankind has been getting more social. So I feel, the human evolution is unstoppable. I mean, from being on all four to standing up and driving in cars, flying there, going into space, I'm sure things are going to happen in that direction. So I have no second thought that mega constellations and international space stations and gateways, and I think it's all going to be very much there and going to happen pretty soon. Now,
Yep.
each of these kinds of evolutions have, at the time of evolution, created situation, created chaos. And every time mankind has handled it in some or the other way, and I'm sure that we would handle this situation also in a good, amicable way. We always believe that growth and governance go hand in hand. They have to be together and balanced. And what Senjuti mentioned about the rules and regulations and the changes that needs to be brought in the various articles, and what Beyza mentioned about bringing in other laws, I'm sure all those things will come into the way of the regulating the growth so that it doesn't get dangerous for the very mankind itself. And last but not the least, I would like to leave with one very important thought, that we as people of this and the coming generations have two very important responsibilities. One, to ensure that the life on Earth is longer and more comfortable. Number two, we also need to look for alternatives. And in this, living these two responsibilities calls for certain evolutions, then we must take it.
So thank you, Laxmesh. Indeed,
Yeah,
Narayan, yes, we can hear you now. So I'd love to get your views.
Sorry
No
about my
problem.
mic. Just to add, the perspective, there are many technological evolutions coming that are specifically targeted at space sustainability, right? People are building ground-based radars, people are building space-based LiDARs, people are building beacons that can be put on satellites, people are building geostationary based assets that can be used for space traffic management, people are building, RF beacons that people can put on their spacecraft to help them track even if the spacecraft is dead. And then people are also building capture mechanisms of deorbiting satellites. So I'm sure that there's going to be a market for this. Space is a limited asset, and once space traffic becomes higher, there's going to be a market for people to clean up those tracks so that they can refill those satellites there as well. So there are multiple approaches being taken. It's a question of demand and supply in the market, and that's how things are going to evolve for me.
Thank you, Narayan. Thank you so much for that. And it's obviously the benefit of being able to have an international panel by virtual means, but the technological challenges that sometimes come with that. So we have just a few minutes left, and I really would like to ask each of you to give some final thoughts from your perspective and from your expertise on indeed how it is that we can best govern these mega constellations of satellites and the issues that they bring with them. Is it something entirely new? Do we need to think, for instance, about hybrid governance, where we have those commercial actors and the government decision makers and the international organizations and other stakeholders? Or is it merely a question of refining what's already in place? So your final thoughts, please. I'll start with you, Senjuti.
Thanks a lot, Cassandra. So I truly believe that laws, even not absolutely robust, regulations and guidelines are certainly in place. Where we falter is the implementation side of it. And the implementation can become even better while actions and activities continue to happen in outer space. Sometimes, yes, detrimental on a lot of levels coming from a sustainability standpoint, but it is also a driving force for laws to become more robust and implemented in a better fashion. Just a short thought here is our team at COMSPOC with the Space Data Association conducted a very recent analysis with their algorithms and using historical flight safety systems. It was stark to notice that 1763 active spacecrafts have been deployed since September 2020. In the year 2017, objects within 1 kilometer of other objects came close to each other around 2,400 times per month. And in 2021, it now occurs roughly 6,000 times per month, which represents a 3.8x increase in conjunction rates. Clearly, the need of the hour is right now to understand that there is a threat and it needs to be mitigated. It cannot just be done with laws. It also needs to have actions of other people who pick up all the waste or people who deorbit within a certain time frame. But given all of this, it is my belief that as things progress, the laws will certainly become more robust. But I just hope that in this process, it doesn't take too long and the laws just never reach there, which has been a pessimistic approach to this for now. But ending on a more positive note, the dilemma in international space law is always that of balancing concerns of orbital congestion along with equitable access. So like all environmental issues that present long-term challenges, simple rules of good conduct may not be enough to stem the spread of space debris. And without an international law to control behavior, it's definitely upon states to legislate in waste treatment or other ways to make this more sustainable. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to take on from where Senjuti left, and I would like to drive the concept of global citizenship and ensure that the intents, innovations, and implementations are civilized. Once we do that, then I think the rules and regulations would be only for those few who are, fall out of this. And I believe that percentage is insignificant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laxmesh. And we do need the ever optimistic view. So thank you so much. Narayan, your final thoughts.
I think we shouldn't really overthink this a lot. There's been a time in the 1990s where people thought that mobile phones will be, based on satellites and not on GSM network that ran on the ground. And eventually, what happened with that and with the bubble being burst, and nowhere near having any evidence that all of these constellations will work in a way that is systematically market driven and will be sustainable. So there is a chance that in 10 years people find out that there's no use of flying satellites and everything being done on the ground is much more sustainable for business, right? So let's not jump to conclusions that everything in space is super scaling towards 1 million satellites up there, and then let's wait and watch what happens.
So I think I'm going to pick up from what Laxmesh just said, because I think I really like the approach on intent and innovation and implementation. And I'll just put into that we really need to think about responsible innovation. We always forget about that part. We focus too much on the risk side. Me included, I'm the most pessimist person probably on Earth when it comes to writing things. But then, we need to think about responsible innovation, and that governance is not only about governing the risk. It's also about how are we going to implement that innovative approaches and governance around that as well. So that's what I would add.
Thank you so much, Beyza. And indeed, I think the idea of global citizenship, or a lot of the work that I do, I try and focus on what is it to be a good space citizen, because in some ways all of us are space citizens because of how dependent we are on space-based services and technologies. And very much so, our countries are becoming more and more space citizens deliberately and actively. And then we have to think about being international and global space citizens as well. So I think it's very worthwhile thinking in those positive terms, although there's no denying that mega-constellations bring with them indeed a very urgent set of issues. Perhaps in some ways it's merely speeding up the concerns that were already around for quite some decades around space traffic management, debris mitigation, active debris removal, and now mega-constellations have sped up the need to really start to think long-term as well as short-term, and to come up with some governance mechanisms, both at the national, domestic level and at the international level. So I really want to thank you all for your time, for your expertise and your insights. It's so valuable having an international panel with so many diverse backgrounds and perspectives and expertise. Thank you, Senjuti. Thank you, Laxmesh. Thank you, Narayan. And thank you, Beyza.